Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, the words, murmurous and uninflected, running together in a soothing tune. But when I asked her, she laughed immoderately, repeated my question aloud, and told me she lived with a girl-friend at a hotel. I laughed aloud as the yolks of their eyeballs rolled toward us in haughty rivalry. "We won't be late if we start now," she insisted aloud. "He told me I eat like a hog once, and I beat him for it." He was reluctant to close the book, reading each item aloud and then looking eagerly at me. "What do people plan?" Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. "It happened, and that's all I know." "Well, if you're a poor driver you oughtn't to try driving at night." "But I wasn't even trying," he explained indignantly, "I wasn't even trying." An odd hush fell upon the bystanders. He had reached an age where death no longer has the quality of ghastly surprise, and when he looked around him now, for the first time, and saw the height and splendor of the hall and the great rooms opening out from it into other rooms, his grief began to be mixed with an odd pride. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively, and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. The bar is in full swing and floating rounds of cocktails permeate the garden outside until the air is alive with chatter and laughter and casual innuendo and introductions forgotten on the spot and enthusiastic meetings between women who never knew each other's names. A momentary hush, the orchestra leader varies his rhythm obligingly for her, and there is a burst of chatter as the erroneous news goes around that she is Gilda Gray's understudy from the Follies. The party has begun. I remember the fur coats of the girls returning from Miss This or That's and the chatter of frozen breath and the hands waving overhead as we caught sight of old acquaintances and the matchings of invitations. "Are you going to the Ordways?" The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch, but the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in '51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. And the Hornbeams and the Willie Voltaires and a whole clan named Blackbuck who always gathered in a corner and flipped up their noses like goats at whosoever came near. San Francisco. I see. My family all died and I came into a good deal of money. His voice was solemn as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. The lights grow brighter as the earth lurches away from the sun, and now the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music and the opera of voices pitches a key higher. Suddenly one of these gypsies in trembling opal seizes a cocktail out of the air, dumps it down for courage, and moving her hands like Frisco dances out alone on the canvas platform. As soon as I arrived, I made an attempt to find my host, but the 2 or 3 people of whom I asked his whereabouts stared at me in such an amazed way and denied so vehemently any knowledge of his movements that I slunk off in the direction of the cocktail table, the only place in the garden where a single man could linger without looking purposeless and alone. "I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon." "No, thanks," said Miss Baker to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry, "I'm absolutely in training." Her host looked at her incredulously. The bar is in full swing and floating rounds of cocktails permeate the garden outside until the air is alive with chatter and laughter and casual innuendo and introductions forgotten on the spot and enthusiastic meetings between women who never knew each other's names. A tray of cocktails floated at us through the twilight and we sat down at a table with the 2 girls in yellow and 3 men, each one introduced to us as Mr. Mumble. "He's a bootlegger," said the young ladies, moving somewhere between his cocktails and his flowers. "When she's had 5 or 6 cocktails she always starts screaming like that. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive." So Tom Buchanan and his girl and I went up together to New York, or not quite together, for Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in another car. For a moment a phrase tried to take shape in my mouth and my lips parted like a dumb man's, as though there was more struggling upon them than a wisp of startled air. "You think I'm pretty dumb, don't you?" he suggested. Things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position. For a moment the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face, her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened, then the glow faded, each light deserting her with lingering regret like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. Daisy took her face in her hands, as if feeling its lovely shape, and her eyes moved gradually out into the velvet dusk. At the enchanted metropolitan twilight I felt a haunting loneliness sometimes, and felt it in others, poor young clerks who loitered in front of windows waiting until it was time for a solitary restaurant dinner, young clerks in the dusk, wasting the most poignant moments of night and life. "Throw me down and beat me, you dirty little coward." A moment later she rushed out into the dusk, waving her hands and shouting. Before he could move from his door, the business was over. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said earnestly. "So I took one look at him," said Mr. Wolfsheim, shaking my hand earnestly, "and what do you think I did?" "What?" I inquired politely. "Daisy, that's all over now," he said earnestly. Daisy's face, tipped sideways beneath a three-cornered lavender hat, looked out at me with a bright ecstatic smile. "It stopped raining." "Has it?" When he realized what I was talking about, that there were twinkle bells of sunshine in the room, he smiled like a weather man, like an ecstatic patron of recurrent light, and repeated the news to Daisy. First he nodded politely, and then his face broke into that radiant and understanding smile, as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots on that fact all the time. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness or forgot them and moved away. There was dancing now on the canvas in the garden, old men pushing young girls backward in eternal graceless circles, superior couples holding each other tortuously, fashionably, and keeping in the corners, and a great number of single girls dancing individualistically or relieving the orchestra for a moment of the burden of the banjo or the traps. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. At first I was flattered to go places with her because she was a golf champion and everyone knew her name. "Please come here." I was flattered that she wanted to speak to me, because of all the older girls I admired her most. There was a wholesome bulkiness about his person and his position, and Daisy was flattered. The little dog was sitting on the table looking with blind eyes through the smoke and from time to time groaning faintly. Blinded by the glare of the headlights and confused by the incessant groaning of the horns, the apparition stood swaying for a moment before he perceived the man in the duster. At first I couldn't find the source of the high, groaning words that echoed clamorously through the bare garage. Then I saw Wilson standing on the raised threshold of his office, swaying back and forth and holding to the doorposts with both hands. See Chapter 8. I couldn't sleep all night, a foghorn was groaning incessantly on the sound, and I tossed half-sick between grotesque reality and savage frightening dreams. But when he heard himself say this, he flinched and began to cry, "Oh, my God," again in his groaning voice. Taking out my handkerchief I wiped from his cheek the remains of the spot of dried lather that had worried me all the afternoon. Daisy's face was smeared with tears, and when I came in she jumped up and began wiping at it with her handkerchief before a mirror. She convinced herself of it and cried into her handkerchief as if the very suggestion was more than she could endure. The only picture was an over-enlarged photograph, apparently a hen sitting on a blurred rock. Looked at from a distance, however, the hen resolved itself into a bonnet and the countenance of a stout old lady beamed down into the room. See Chapter 5. W. Hen. I came home to West Egg that night. I was afraid for a moment that my house was on fire. He informed me that he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer and had made the dim enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother, which hovered like an ectoplasm on the wall. The straw seats of the car hovered on the edge of combustion. The woman next to me perspired delicately for a while into her white shirtwaist, and then, as her newspaper dampened under her fingers, lapsed despairingly into deep heat with a desolate cry. A silver curve of the moon hovered already in the western sky. There was nothing in it but a small expensive dog leash made of leather and braided silver. She tried to tell me about it, but I knew it was something funny. "You mean your wife bought it?" She had it wrapped in tissue paper on her bureau. Michaelis didn't see anything odd in that, and he gave Wilson a dozen reasons why his wife might have bought the dog leash. He began to rock again, and Michaelis stood twisting the leash in his hand. Sometimes in the course of gay parties women used to rub champagne into his hair. For himself, he formed the habit of letting liquor alone. She must have broken her rule against drinking that night, for when she arrived she was stupid with liquor and unable to understand that the ambulance had already gone to Flushing. However, that was my fault, for he was one of those who used to sneer most bitterly at Gatsby on the courage of Gatsby's liquor, and I should have known better than to call him. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered across the moonlight, and turning my head to watch it I saw that I was not alone. 50 feet away a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion and was standing with his hands in his pockets regarding the silver pepper of the stars. He had waited 5 years and bought a mansion where he dispensed starlight to casual moths so that he could come over some afternoon to a stranger's garden. He stopped at the garage for a pneumatic mattress that had amused his guests during the summer, and the chauffeur helped him pump it up. Gatsby shouldered the mattress and started for the pool. With little ripples that were hardly the shadows of waves, the laden mattress moved irregularly down the pool. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Maecenas knew. The notion originated with Daisy's suggestion that we hire 5 bathrooms and take cold baths, and then assumed more tangible form as a place to have a mint julep. Each of us said over and over that it was a crazy idea. We all talked at once to a baffled clerk and thought, or pretended to think, that we were being very funny. Call up and order some ice for the mint julep. As Tom took up the receiver, the compressed heat exploded into sound, and we were listening to the portentous chords of Mendelssohn's Wedding March from the ballroom below. A waiter knocked and came in with crushed mint and ice, but the silence was unbroken by his "thank you" and the soft closing of the door. "And I'll make you a mint julep. Look at the mint." "Wait a minute," snapped Tom, "I want to ask Mr. Gatsby one more question." "Go on," Gatsby said politely. There is always a halt there of at least a minute, and it was because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. See Chapter 4 Sunday morning, while church bells rang in the villages alongshore the world, and its mistress returned to Gatsby's house and twinkled hilariously on his lawn. His wife and his mistress, until an hour ago secure and inviolate, were slipping precipitately from his control. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold, and wide open to the warm windy afternoon, and Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the 2 young women preceded us out onto a rosy-colored porch open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. When, almost immediately, the telephone rang inside and the butler left the porch, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned toward me. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library, as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body. While trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. Jordan's party were calling impatiently to her from the porch, but she lingered for a moment to shake hands. A sudden emptiness seemed to flow now from the windows and the great doors, endowing with complete isolation the figure of the host who stood on the porch, his hand up in a formal gesture of farewell. "I'm delighted to see you," said Gatsby standing on his porch. "Excuse me for just a minute." The rest of us walked out on the porch, where Sloane and the lady began an impassioned conversation aside. Tom stopped beside the porch and looked up at the second floor, where 2 windows bloomed with light among the vines. As we walked across the moonlight gravel to the porch, he disposed of the situation in a few brisk phrases. She must have seen something of this in my expression, for she turned abruptly away and ran up the porch steps into the house. crossing the porch where we had dined that June night 3 months before I came to a small rectangle of light which I guessed was the pantry window. As I tiptoed from the porch, I heard my taxi feeling its way along the dark road toward the house. Her porch was bright with the bought luxury of starshine. The wicker of the settee squeaked fashionably as she turned toward him and he kissed her curious and lovely mouth. It was 9 o'clock when we finished breakfast and went out on the porch. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead when the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. So my first impression, that he was a person of some undefined consequence, had gradually faded and he had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. After a moment, the proprietor emerged from the interior of his establishment and gazed hollow-eyed at the car. The reluctance to go home was not confined to wayward men. Then, with reluctance, "I want to get the grass cut," he said. "I never loved him," she said, with perceptible reluctance. 2 o'clock and the whole corner of the peninsula was blazing with light which fell unreal on the shrubbery and made thin elongating glints upon the roadside wires. The room was large and stifling, and, though it was already 4 o'clock, opening the windows admitted only a gust of hot shrubbery from the park. For all I knew he was going to rob the house in a moment, I wouldn't have been surprised to see sinister faces, the faces of Wolfsheim's people, behind him in the dark shrubbery. It was on that slender riotous island which extends itself due east of New York and where there are, among other natural curiosities, 2 unusual formations of land. She was a slender, small-breasted girl, with an erect carriage which she accentuated by throwing her body backward at the shoulders like a young cadet. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned a page with a flutter of slender muscles in her arms. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30 with a solid sticky bob of red hair and a complexion powdered milky white. With Jordan's slender golden arm resting in mine, we descended the steps and sauntered about the garden. "I've been drunk for about a week now, and I thought it might sober me up to sit in a library." "Has it?" "A little bit, I think." The hall was at present occupied by 2 deplorably sober men and their highly indignant wives. He was employed in a vague personal capacity. While he remained with Cody he was in turn steward, mate, skipper, secretary, and even jailer, for Dan Cody sober knew what lavish doings Dan Cody drunk might soon be about, and he provided for such contingencies by reposing more and more trust in Gatsby. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram, life is much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. Upstairs, in the solemn echoing drive, she let 4 taxi cabs drive away before she selected a new one, lavender-colored with gray upholstery, and in this, we slid out from the mass of the station into the glowing sunshine. "San Francisco. I see. My family all died and I came into a good deal of money." His voice was solemn as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. It was Gatsby's father, a solemn old man very helpless and dismayed, bundled up in a long cheap ulster against the warm September day. I am part of that, a little solemn with the feel of those long winters, a little complacent from growing up in the Caraway house in a city where dwellings are still called through decades by a family's name. In the foreground 4 solemn men in dress suits are walking along the sidewalk with a stretcher on which lies a drunken woman in a white evening dress. Blinded by the glare of the headlights and confused by the incessant groaning of the horns, the apparition stood swaying for a moment before he perceived the man in the duster. At first I couldn't find the source of the high, groaning words that echoed clamorously through the bare garage. Then I saw Wilson standing on the raised threshold of his office, swaying back and forth and holding to the doorposts with both hands. "I want to get his name." Some words of this conversation must have reached Wilson, swaying in the office door, for suddenly a new theme found voice among his gasping cries. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library, as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body. While trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. The notion originated with Daisy's suggestion that we hire 5 bathrooms and take cold baths, and then assumed more tangible form as a place to have a mint julep. Each of us said over and over that it was a crazy idea. We all talked at once to a baffled clerk and thought, or pretended to think, that we were being very funny. But with every word she was drawing further and further into herself, so he gave that up, and only the dead dream fought on as the afternoon slipped away, trying to touch what was no longer tangible, struggling unhappily, undespairingly, toward that lost voice across the room. There were 3 married couples and Jordan's escort, a persistent undergraduate given to violent innuendo, and obviously under the impression that sooner or later Jordan was going to yield him up her person to a greater or lesser degree. The undergraduate nodded in a cynical, melancholy way. Eluding Jordan's undergraduate, who was now engaged in an obstetrical conversation with 2 chorus girls, and who implored me to join him, I went inside. The idea is if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put this 5th guest's shrill, metallic urgency out of mind. I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. I was sure the request would be something utterly fantastic, and for a moment I was sorry I'd ever set foot upon his overpopulated lawn. The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. The transactions in Montana copper that made him many times a millionaire found him physically robust but on the verge of soft-mindedness, and, suspecting this, an infinite number of women tried to separate him from his money. Life starts all over again when it gets crisp in the fall. But it's so hot, insisted Daisy, on the verge of tears, and everything's so confused. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library, as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body. While trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. Over the ash heaps, the giant eyes of Dr. T. J. Eckelberg kept their vigil, but I perceived, after a moment, that other eyes were regarding us with peculiar intensity from less than 20 feet away. "Good night, old sport." He put his hands in his coat pockets and turned back eagerly to his scrutiny of the house, as though my presence marred the sacredness of the vigil. Taking a white card from his wallet, he waved it before the man's eyes. "Jimmy sent me this picture." He took out his wallet with trembling fingers. Then he returned the wallet and pulled from his pocket a ragged old copy of a book called Hopalong Cassidy. "Look here, this is a book he had when he was a boy. He had changed it at the age of 17 and at the specific moment that witnessed the beginning of his career, when he saw Dan Cody's yacht drop anchor over the most insidious flat on Lake Superior. Then he drifted back to Lake Superior, and he was still searching for something to do on the day that Dan Cody's yacht dropped anchor in the shallows along shore. The none too savory ramifications by which Ella Kay, the newspaper woman, played Madame de Maintenon to his weakness and sent him to sea in a yacht, were common knowledge to the turgid journalism of 1902. To the young Gats, resting on his oars and looking up at the railed deck, the yacht represented all the beauty and glamour in the world. A large photograph of an elderly man in yachting costume attracted me, hung on the wall over his desk. He used to be my best friend years ago. There was a small picture of Gatsby, also in yachting costume, on the bureau, Gatsby with his head thrown back defiantly, taken apparently when he was about 18. A few days later, he took him to Duluth and bought him a blue coat, 6 pair of white duck trousers, and a yachting cap.